My name is Jacob Balazer. I'm going to introduce ACES and ACEScc and show you how to use them in Sony Vegas Pro. ACES is a color management system for motion pictures. It can help you get better color and more consistent color more easily. The Academy Color Encoding System is a color encoding system and workflow for motion pictures from the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. It's standardized, cross-product, and free. It consists of the ACES and ACEScc working color spaces, input device transforms, a reference rendering transform, and output device transforms. This summary shows how all those components fit together. Each camera records in a color space specific to that camera, which the input device transform transforms into either the ACES or ACEScc working color space. The working color space is where you do all your editing, filtering, and compositing. Then to view the video, it goes through the reference rendering transform, which contains a standard film-like contrast curve, and then an output device transform specific to the type of output device you're using. The big advantage of ACES is that you can defer decisions about exposure, color balance, saturation, and contrast. You don't need to have them set perfectly in the camera while you're shooting because ACES lets you adjust them easily and accurately after the fact. In ACES, the workflow determines the look of the final video, not the camera you're shooting with so much, so it's easy to match between shots and between cameras. You can do your editing and color correction all in the same application, and you can render from the same timeline for multiple types of display devices. ACES works best when you have a device-specific input device transform for each of your cameras. If you don't have one, you can use a generic Rec. 709 input transform, but it's not as accurate and you won't have the same latitude for adjustments. Vegas's 32-bit ACES processing is slow, but not too slow to be usable. And finally, filters may not work as expected in ACES or ACEScc. Vegas's nominal 32-bit floating point working space is 0 to 1. That's the range used by most of Vegas's input and output, and by the media generators, and it's also the range shown in the video scopes. Vegas does allow values below 0 and above 1, but not all filters will preserve them. ACES and ACEScc are scene-referred color spaces. That means they describe the images as seen by the camera's sensor. Most color spaces are display-referred, which means the signals are only meant to be sent to a display and not to be manipulated. ACES and ACEScc are universal color spaces. They can fully represent the image of almost any camera. And they're mathematically uniform color spaces, which make them very good for exposure compensation and color balancing. Illuminance is the intensity of the light seen by the camera's sensor. In a linear color space, the color values are proportional to the illuminance. Every doubling of the color value is perceived as a roughly equal increase in brightness. And that means as the image gets brighter, the color values become very large very quickly. They're growing exponentially, and so a linear color space needs a wide range of color values to represent natural images. In a logarithmic color space, every doubling of the illuminance is an equal addition to the color value. So a logarithmic color space is much closer to being perceptually uniform. A logarithmic color space also requires a much smaller range of values. ACES is a linear color space and ACEScc is logarithmic. ACES has a nearly unlimited dynamic range. But since it's linear, the color values get very large as the image gets brighter, and you can see from this table that middle gray is much closer to the minimum than it is to the maximum. ACEScc has a 17.5 stop dynamic range between the color values 0 and 1, and middle gray is fairly close to the middle at 0.41, which is similar to a traditional video color space. The dynamic range of ACEScc between color values 0 and 1 is much larger than almost any video camera. A typical video camera will have its minimum value somewhere between 4 and 7 stops below middle gray, and its maximum value about 4 to 7 stops above middle gray, which could be anywhere from 2 to 20 in ACES or about 0.6 or 0.7 in ACEScc. ACEScc actually allows values below 0 and above 1, but in practice you won't have to use them. Primary color correction is performed equally well in ACES and in ACEScc. In ACES, they're done as gain operations using the Sony levels filter. 2x gain means adding one stop, and 0.5x gain means subtracting one stop. In ACEScc, color correction is performed as an offset operation. A 0.057 difference means adding or subtracting one stop. ACES has a practically unlimited dynamic range and a gamut that includes every visible color. ACEScc has a smaller gamut and a smaller dynamic range between 0 to 1, but it's still very large, and in practice either color space is just fine. In ACES, filters and compositing act just like optical processes. In the linear color space, adding color values is the same as adding light. So for example, compositing two images by addition is just like doing a double exposure. But the problem with ACES is that it uses such a large range of color values, so traditional video filters won't behave as expected. Many of them don't operate outside the 0 to 1 range. And that's the advantage of ACEScc. It uses primarily the 0 to 1 range, so it works very well with traditional video filters. ACEScc is good for secondary color correction and color curves. But ACEScc is not good for doing photorealistic filtering and compositing. Vegas has several built-in input color spaces, most importantly S-Log1 and S-Log2, which are used by a variety of Sony cameras. But if you change the OpenColorIO configuration of Sony Vegas, you can support a large number of additional camera color spaces, including a generic Rec. 709 color space, which will work with almost any video camera. I've created a custom configuration which you can download from my website. Vegas has a built-in view transform for sRGB, which is the standard color space for computer monitors. I've added a Rec. 709 view transform to the custom configuration posted on my website. You can exchange ACES footage for import into another project or another tool. The ACES color space can be used in OpenEXR files, which are high-precision, full-range files. The files are super high quality, but also huge and not practical for most video work. ACES proxy stores the same range as ACEScc, but in a 10-bit or 12-bit format. Officially, the Academy would have you store everything in ACES in EXR files, but there's no reason you can't use ACES proxy for video files also. You can also use a camera color space such as Sony S-Log2. S-Log2 has a smaller range than ACES proxy, which means it can be used in 10-bit or 8-bit formats. S-Log2 is widely supported by software that uses ACES. When you're shooting for ACES, the best exposure setting really depends on the camera you're shooting with. On the Sony a7S, for example, you want to overexpose by 2 to 3 stops. Using a standard Rec. 709 camera, you want to set all of the camera settings as you normally would so that the output will require as little adjustment as possible in ACES. Sony Vegas comes with an OpenColorIO configuration for the ACES workflow, but it doesn't map levels correctly during rendering, and it doesn't include very many color spaces. I've created a new ACES configuration and also an ACEScc configuration, which you can download from my website. The files need to be copied into the Vegas Program Files folder before you open Vegas. First, I'll show you the ACES workflow and then an ACEScc workflow. Once your configuration files have been copied in, the first step for using ACES or ACEScc is to open the project properties and change the pixel format to 32-bit floating point full range. You also need a compositing gamma of 2.222. Now what that does is make all the compositing and filters operate linearly. Never mind that it says 1.0 is linear, 2.222 is the setting you want. And finally, selecting a view transform enables the ACES or ACEScc workflow. Typically, you'll choose sRGB as your view transform, which is the color space of standard computer monitors. Next, for each of your project video files, you need to set the color space in the media properties. This particular clip was recorded on the Sony A7S with S-Log2 and S-Gamut, so I'm going to choose the S-Log2 color space. Now you can see that the colors are looking much more natural, but the shot is overexposed by about 2 stops. The first thing you want to do with any video clip in ACES is exposure compensation. We do exposure compensation using the Sony Levels filter. I've created a linear gradient to show you how that works. You can see that the levels make a straight line in the video scope. If I add a Sony Levels filter and reduce the output end, the line stays straight but the values are reduced. The Sony Levels filter operates linearly on the input color values. Reducing the output end is like applying a gain factor of less than 1. 0.5 divides all the values by 2, which is a one-stop reduction in exposure. Decreasing the input end has the opposite effect. It applies a gain factor greater than 1. 0.5 doubles all the values. That corresponds to a one-stop increase in exposure. Never mind that the scope is showing clipping here. The Levels filter actually preserves values above 1, which is what we need for working in ACES, since ACES uses such a large range of values. What the Levels filter is actually doing is taking the ratio of the output end to the input end, and using that as the gain factor. So now back to our video clip, I'm going to add a Sony Levels filter and reduce the output end to reduce the exposure. All you need to do is drag the slider until the image looks good to you. To make Vegas more responsive during adjustments, I usually set the preview quality to draft full or draft half. Next, we need to do color balancing, which we'll also do with the Sony Levels filter. 3 of them for red, green, and blue. And so in the first Levels filter, we set the channel to red, in the second to green, and in the third to blue. And now we do a gain adjustment just like before. I recorded this video using a colored filter and I didn't adjust the white balance properly in the camera, so it's coming out looking much too green. So I'm going to reduce the green level until I get the video to look right. Color balancing is an iterative process. You're going to go back and adjust all of the channels until the image looks right. One trick is to reduce the input end and the output end so that you can get fine adjustment near unity. And now for the blue, I'll use the same trick. So that's it for exposure compensation and color balancing, which are the 2 corrections you'll want to make to all your videos. After you've done the color balancing, you can use the Sony color corrector to adjust saturation, but I usually find it's not necessary. If you want to adjust contrast, you should do that last, again using a Sony Levels filter. I'm going to set the input end and the output end to a value of 0.2. That's my pivot for the contrast adjustment. And I've chosen 0.2 because it's just above the middle gray of 0.18. And now you drag the gamma slider to adjust the contrast. A reduction in gamma is an increase in contrast, and an increase in gamma is a reduction in contrast. I usually don't need to adjust contrast, so I leave the gamma set to 1. And so this is the chain of filters that you're going to use on most videos in the ACES workflow. You can save your filter chain settings into a filter package for easy access on each new video. I'd suggest using defaults of 0.7 for your input end and output end on your exposure compensation levels filter and the 3 levels filters for color balancing. Click the plugin chain button and then click Save As and give your plugin package a name. Now when you add filters for a new video event, you can get your saved plugin chain from the filter packages folder. Here's another, this one recorded by the Panasonic GH2. As before, I need to set the color space in the media properties. I've created a custom color space for the Panasonic GH2. You can see that this clip was underexposed by about a stop. So I'm going to use my saved filter package. And the first thing to do is to correct the exposure. I'll increase the output end and decrease the input end until the image looks right. And there, with a little more than one stop added gain, it looks pretty good. This clip doesn't need too much color correction, but still I always tweak the color balance. And with both corrections, you can see that the image looks much better. Moving forward, I'll show you a moment in the shot where there's a lot of lens flare. At this point, I want to increase the contrast, but the first step will be to adjust the exposure. The image is too bright. Now when it's time to render, you'll also need to select your output color space. Choose an output format template. I usually use ACES. Then customize the template, and on the Project tab, select a color space. Rec 709 video file maps levels correctly for a video file, and it's usually the transform you want to use when you're rendering to a file. Once the correct color space is chosen, then you just render like you normally would, and the output file will be generated using the color space that you chose. And that's it for the ACES workflow. Exposure compensation, color balancing, saturation, and contrast are usually all you need. But keep in mind, ACES does not lend itself very well to other types of filters, especially color curves. For that, you'll want to use ACEScc instead of ACES, which means copying a different configuration into the Vegas Pro program files folder. Restart Sony Vegas to load the new configuration. Then in the project properties, you're going to select 32-bit floating point full range, a compositing gamma of 2.222, and a view transform for the type of monitor you're using. As before, you need to set the color space in the media properties. The color space settings are saved in the project file even if you change OpenColorIO configurations. In ACEScc, exposure compensation and color balancing are performed as offset operations instead of gain operations, so we need to use different filters. Here again is a linear gradient shown in the video scope. For exposure compensation, I'm going to use the Sony brightness and contrast filter. And you can see the way it operates is to add or subtract the same number from every color value. So back to the video clip, first I add a Sony brightness and contrast filter, and then perform the exposure compensation. This control is very sensitive. You can make fine adjustments by holding down the control key and using the arrow keys, or by holding down the control key and clicking and dragging the slider. So with exposure compensation done, the next step is color balancing. Color balancing is also performed as offset operations, but the Sony brightness and contrast filter doesn't let you select the color channel. So instead we're going to use the Sony channel blend filter. Here again is a linear gradient shown in the video scope. The red, green, and blue channel offset are in the last column, and you can see here that it's adjusting each channel independently of the others. But the controls are very sensitive. To make fine adjustments, hold down the control key, click just between the up and down arrows, and drag the mouse up or down. Now back to my video clip, I'm going to add a Sony channel blend filter. As before, this clip has too much green, so I'm going to hold down Control, click and drag the green down. A little bit more blue. Actually, you only ever need to adjust 2 of the 3 colors, but having all 3 makes the job easier. Saturation again should come after color balancing using the Sony color corrector filter, but I find I usually don't need to make this adjustment on my videos. Contrast adjustment, if necessary, should come last in your filter chain using another brightness and contrast filter. You should set the contrast center to something near middle gray or 0.41. And then just drag the contrast slider up or down. The advantage of the ACEScc workflow is that you can use many more types of filters. Looking at the video scopes for this natural image, you can see that it falls well inside the ACEScc 0 to 1 range. In fact, you're usually between 0.2 and 0.6. And that means, for example, that you can use the Sony Color Curves filter, which only operates on input values in the 0 to 1 range. In ACEScc, color curves doesn't work exactly like the same filter in a traditional video file, since the logarithmic color space is different, but it's close enough that if you know how to use color curves, you'll be able to get the results you want in ACEScc. So that's it. ACES and ACEScc make video production easier. Now you don't need to worry about setting everything perfectly in your camera while you're shooting, because you can make accurate adjustments after the fact. And the look is dictated by your workflow, not by the camera you're shooting with, so it's easier to match between different types of cameras. Feel free to post your questions and I'll do my best to answer them. Thanks for watching.